Welcome back to the recipe book. We already use ngIf and ngFor in this section, so we're already using directives. But now I want to enhance this project by adding our own directive, which allows us to open the drop-downs, which don't work as of now if you click them. They don't work because we didn't import Bootstrap's JavaScript code, and I don't want to import this because Angular should be the only thing interacting with my DOM. But now with the directive knowledge, we can create our own directive which will manipulate these buttons. I'll add the directive in the shared folder and I will name it dropdown directive. So the file is named dropdown directive.ts. Of course, you could use the CLI to create it, and you could even point to the shared folder in the command to automatically generate it in this shared folder. I'll do it manually though, always a good practice. And here the name should be dropdown directive like this. And of course, we need to add a decorator to turn this into a directive. So it's the add directive decorator, which needs to be imported from @Angular core. And here there is one thing I need to set up. On the selector, I want to define how I can add my directive. And I will use an attribute selector, therefore I'll enclose the name in squared brackets. The name now will be app dropdown, to have a unique name which doesn't accidentally interfere with an officially existing attribute name or anything like that. Now what should this directive do? I want to add some functionality to it, which allows us to add a certain CSS class to the element it sits on once it is clicked, so once this element the directive sits on is clicked, and remove the class once we click again, let's say. So this is your challenge. Try implementing such a method, which basically listens to clicks and then toggles some property which determines whether some class is attached or not, and also try implementing some code which dynamically attaches a CSS class or not. Before you actually start though, let's find out which class we need to attach. If you go to the recipe detail component here, if you attach the open CSS class to the div which holds button group, and you go to your application and select the recipe, you see now it looks like the dropdown was opened. So it's this open CSS class, the same for the usage in the header we need to attach. So that's your challenge. Build a dropdown directive which attaches this class whenever we click on it or removes it once we click a second time. Let's build this directive together now. So as explained, I want to toggle it upon clicking this. So to listen to a click, I should add host listener, which is to be imported from Angular core, and I want to listen to a click event. Then I want to execute toggle open, which looks like or sounds like a fitting name because that is what I want to do. I want to toggle whether this should be opened or not. Well, then I will add isOpen directive, which I'll set to false initially. And in my host listener, I'll simply set open or isOpen to, well, what it is currently not. So if isOpen was true, it will now be set to false and the other way around. So with that, I'm toggling that property. Now to dynamically attach or detach a CSS class depending on this, all I have to do is I'll add host binding, which needs to be imported from Angular core and allows us to bind to properties of the element the directive is placed on. And here I want to bind to the class property of that component, of that element. Class simply is an array of all the classes. And here it's all about this open class. As you learned, that's the CSS class we need to attach dynamically or detach. And now the rest will be handled by Angular. Since I bind to isOpen, this will not be attached initially. Whenever isOpen switches to true, it will be attached, and whenever it switches to false, it will be removed. And that's our entire directive. Now to be able to use it, I need to go to app module and add it here, add the dropdown directive, and add the import pointing to the shared folder. And with that imported now, I can use it. I can use it in the detail component. Here, I have to use it on the div or on the element where open should be attached to in the end. So in this case, the div with the button group class. And here I'll add my own app dropdown directive without squared brackets, without assigning any value because, well, I don't need to configure anything on this directive. And now in the header, here the place where I need to add it is this list item with the class of dropdown. Here, this is what will actually need the open class to show something. With that in place and ng-serve still running, let's save this and view this in our application and see if this works the way it should. Let's test it in the header. Looks pretty good. We close it by clicking again. And here on our recipe, that looks awesome too. So that's working exactly the way I want it to work. And with that in place, that already is everything I wanted to build. So a relatively short recipe book section here. Now we can move on to services, a very powerful tool. And then we will add services in this app here to greatly enhance it and fix some things which we had to do kind of complicated thus far. We'll also add some new features. Welcome to a new module in this course. This module is about services and dependency injection. Now, what is that? Let's start with services. What are services? Let's consider this application. We got an app component, an about component, an user component, and a user detail component. Now, we might have some methods in those components. Let's say we want to log some data to the console in the about component and in the user detail component. And somehow this log statement is pretty similar, so pretty much the same text. So we're basically repeating ourselves here. We're duplicating code in two different components. Let's say in the user component, we also want to access some data, some array of users maybe. And maybe we also don't know if we will later use that in some other part of our application. Both use cases, duplication of code and data storage, providing data, are typical use cases for a service, because a service is basically just another piece in your Angular app, another class you can add, which acts as a central repository, as a central business unit, you could say, something where you can store, where you can centralize your code in. So we could create a log service, for example, to centralize our log statement. We could create a user service to manage the data storage here. Let's see this in a real app so that it becomes more clear though. Here's an example app which you can find attached to this lecture. Here we can create some accounts. You see we start with 3 accounts here at the bottom. We can switch the status of these accounts and you can see that whenever I switch it, I log something to the console. You can also see that this gets logged if I create a new account here. And overall, what we got here is the logging and the data storage. So in general, tasks which might be centralized. We also communicate between these components. That's another area where services can be really helpful. Because let's have a look at our code. I got 3 components, the app component, then the account and the new account component. The app component is where all comes together. There in the template I embed the app new account and the app account component, and I use property and event binding to pass data around. For example, I loop through all accounts, which are right now stored in the app account, in the app component here, and I pass them via property binding to the app account component here. And there, on the other hand, I have an event which gets fired when I click one of the 3 change the status buttons, which is emitted here, which will be catched by my app component, where I then handle it again. So I do have event binding to be informed in my app component whenever something changes in the account component. Pretty much the same happens in the new account component. There I can also listen to a click when I create a new account, and on such a click I emit some data to the app component. So this is all fine, but we already got quite a complex setup here to pass data around. And that even though that it's still relatively simple, it's not a complex app here after all. Now, in this lecture, we're going to see how services can help us with that and what we have to watch out for. So let's dive into it and build our first service in the next lecture. As mentioned at the end of the last lecture, I want to start by building our first service here, a service which takes over this logging task here. So a service where we can log data. Now, how do we create a new service? How does a service look like in Angular? Creating it is super simple. First, we have to choose a fitting place. Now, since this service will do some generic task, I will place it in the app folder. You could also create a shared subfolder there. I will again place it right in the app main folder, and I will simply name it logging. And the file name should be logging.service.ts to follow this convention of being pretty clear about what's in a file. So here, this file will hold a service, so that's why I'll name it like this. There, I will export a TypeScript class, and I will name this class logging service2, again, to be explicit about what this class does. Now, a component becomes a component because we attach this add component decorator. A directive becomes a directive because we attach add directive. You could think that we now simply add service, right? But we don't do that. A service is just a normal TypeScript class. Like this. This can already be used as a service. So here we could create a helper method, log2console, and simply pass the message. But since we know that we simply want to log the change of account status here, I will simply say log status change like this and take the new status, which will be a string, as an argument. Here I can then simply copy the code I do have in one of my components right now, this console log code here, and copy it into my logging service here. Of course, account status now is just status here, this argument we're getting. So with that, remove the colon, semicolon. With that, I centralized this code. Now we need to use this service in our other components. So everywhere where we console log. Now you could think that we simply use it by importing it at the top of our file. So here we could import the logging service from, and now let's move up to the main folder, and then here from the logging service TS file. And then we could simply create our service like this, new logging service. And on our service here, we could call log status change and pass the new account status. And actually, if I get rid of this code here, this will work. Let it recompile. And if I now create a new service here, you see I do log it to the console. So this would work, and still this is wrong. This is not, and this is super important, this is not how you use a service in Angular. The reason for this will become more clearer throughout this module, but generally Angular provides a much better way of getting access to your services. And therefore you should not create the instances manually. So let's get rid of that import and of that instantiation, and let's learn in the next video which tool Angular offers us to get access to our services.